I was talking to my friend about the ICE thing, and he goes, "Man, that's a bad look, what they did." And I was like, "It's also a bad thing to." I don't think optics are the issue here. You should just not murder civilians. That's kind of a good rule of thumb. It's weird times, man. Because when I was growing up, you'd hear all these government people go on TV and be like, "You can't listen to rap music because they're talking about murdering people." And now I'm watching TV and federal employees are murdering people, and rappers are like, "This is fucked up." So.
Yeah, I've definitely seen clips of his.
Yeah, he's. I think I've listened to all of his shows that are on Apple Music. So, yeah. So,
Yeah, I think
I like the juxtaposition. You know, and it actually takes me back. And I've been talking to people. I do want to talk about ICE, and I do want to incorporate something that was said to me in this conversation, because I think this is where two white passing people, men who have a podcast should really go.
Well, and so as I was putting thoughts together, like it's not that I specifically want to talk about the articles as much as it is reference, because I have a lot of thoughts that are jumbled. Well, maybe not even jumbled as much as very reactionary, which I think is warranted based on everything. And it seemed like the type of thing that was worth at least having a conversation around, because it's important. It's important to go on record as in some level of opposition to the ongoing oppression of peoples, maybe is a nice way of saying it. But two, it's a big enough thing that it seemed like it was probably about time to dive into it a little bit. And so that's where my thoughts were.
Yeah. So I've seen a number. So one of the things I've been putting out there. So I called both of our senators, and yeah, nobody ever answers, or at least I've never had anyone answer for calls. Senator Tuberville, their voice box, their voicemail was full. So I'm hoping that's encouraging. And that people are calling to express their disgust and contempt for what's happening. And Senator Britt, I was able to leave a message there, and just particularly to indicate that I didn't want them to fund the bill that was going to be passed to further fund ICE.
I have some thoughts about that, and I wish I had saved where I saw it. There was something that I remember seeing that said that the current bill with the funding for DHS was misleading from the standpoint of how it would impact the current ICE operations. So essentially, the big, I don't even want to call it the big beautiful bill that they dubbed it, but that piece of shit legislation that got passed last year, essentially funded ICE for the foreseeable future. That the funds specifically up for vote now would actually impact other areas of DHS more so than immigration enforcement. And I don't know how accurate that is. This is why I was saying I kind of wish I had saved it. Because it could very well be that the current bill just really has no effect on the current situation. That doesn't mean that it's still not worth making a political statement over. It's just that changes my view on how important it is to make that statement, as opposed to just shutting everything down or something more targeted at the current events than what that bill might be. So it doesn't really change like my desired outcome. It just changes whether I think blocking that one is as important as new legislation targeted at actually controlling federal agencies. Hopefully that makes sense.
I think so.
And it really doesn't matter for the scope of what you were saying. It's just that everything that I have seen publicly from our senators has been a shit show from day one. And the most recent thing that I saw from Katie Britt's office, I assume it was from her office. It was posted on her social media, which I'm certain she doesn't actually type herself, but who knows. But it was more of the same. It was a opening statement that was probably fine, and then it was 2 or 3 paragraphs of just more ridiculousness in the scope of current things and very clearly that her vote, no matter what any constituents want, is going to go to continuing to fund the Department of Homeland Security anyway.
Party lines, yeah.
Yeah. But all of that to say that part of what makes me think that something might be more effective would be specifically calling for federal law enforcement officials to be held to the same standards as local and state law enforcement officials with regard to recourse from the civil side of things. For example, and this is why I wanted to bookmark the couple of the couple of articles that I had put in, because the Morrill Project did a decent write-up on why it's so difficult to gain any traction with, like in this particular instance, suing ICE and getting any type of traction for that to go anywhere. And it's because the 1871, 1872, the law that's often referred to as the KKK Act, specifically meant that state and local law enforcement officers could be held to civil rights lawsuits for their behaviors for transgressions. But crucially, federal law enforcement officials were not included in that. And the technicality would be that the federal government was doing this to protect, local citizenry from local and state law enforcement. And now the script's been turned a little bit. So, in my head, where I've gone to over the past past week or two, has been more how much more effective it might be to push for that type of thing as opposed to targeting the funding side of things. That's kind of what I was trying to summarize in a way that made sense.
It's kind of like, don't fund them, but if they get funded, then hold them accountable at a much higher level than they have been accountable for.
Right. And predominantly because the big bill already funded them for at least the next few years.
Okay.
Or at least that's my understanding.
I thought the Senate yesterday was voting. I thought yesterday the Senate was going to vote on further funding them or additional fund. I don't know.
Well, that's where I wish I had saved the article, because something that I had seen made it sound like that funding was more for the other components that comprise DHS than it was specifically ICE.
Gotcha.
But again, that could have been a misleading take. I didn't research it. It was one of those things that sparked another thought along the same train of jumbled thoughts. So not to have derailed us, but my lack of faith in our that's putting it too nicely. My lack of thinking that our senators would do jack shit other than pad their wallets basically means that I expect nothing to be worth pursuing from a funding bill perspective, unfortunately.
Yeah. The thing that's been going through my mind is I don't know the exact quote, because I've seen I don't know that there's a necessarily a concise quote that talks about this, but there's a letter Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in 1963 to the Birmingham. I think it was letter. I don't know if it's called Letter from a Birmingham Jail. I'm looking at it. I'm looking at a page from the African Studies Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and basically what I've heard, and the gist of what I've heard was that the one of the most dangerous. Let me see. I'm trying to figure out exactly how to say, because I don't want to mince King's words, but in the letter he describes the white moderate as being more dangerous than the KKK.
Yeah,
are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
Yeah, so I did a little bit of research into that for a tangentially related thing. I'll put it that way.
Okay. Oh, is it something that I might be able to see on Friday?
Yeah, there's a reference to it there. So
okay.
it's not a lot. It's just that because of everything that's been going on. Yeah. And so I tried to pay a bit more attention to some of the things that I had not paid as much attention to, which is one of the things that you're referencing, where I don't remember the exact wording, but it was essentially that those who were not standing one way or the other, so to speak, but that more kind of midline, trying to be an ally but not taking a stand kind of position, were more difficult or more of a hindrance to change, because the extremists were more easy to point to and say this is the problem than those who were a part of the problem without realizing they were a part of the problem.
Yeah, and I feel though that not to in the past couple of weeks somebody used that to describe me, and I was a little bit I'm not going to say offended by that, but I wasn't expecting that, and so I've been thinking about it for a while, and I don't necessarily agree, because when I was reading about when I was reading through this, it just made me something like I want to be aware of it, and I don't want to be the moderate. And what I understand about what Dr. King was specifically talking about was that it's those who expect one of the things I remember reading was that those that expect a tensionless change from the current order to a new order where people of color have equality it's not going to be it's not going to be given up. It's not going to come without tension, and I think maybe tension is underplaying it. I think I wholeheartedly think that it is going to have to be taken because it won't be given, and it's not going to look good, and we're already in a place where it's not looking good. And so, and it's been on my mind, because I don't want to be blocking progress.
It's an interesting thing to think about from the perspective of what we understand about change. And I don't know how I would describe it. So this is going to be kind of feeling out how I would kind of state what my thought process is, because I don't know that I have it formalized. Change requires some sort of action. I mean, that's an easy statement to make. But that action depends on so many different variables that if you kind of peel it back to its most basic, I think you would point to probably the quote that all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Where what is something that you could do? And being vocal or being an opponent is doing something, right? And so it's difficult to draw that line along the point of being a blocker for progress, I suppose, because you're not being more forceful desiring change, when sometimes being vocal is the only thing you know to do, right?
Yeah.
And so if you really want to take it kind of as a piecemeal examination of what does it mean, and maybe it's better to pull up the quote and try to do it that way, but I took it more along the lines of, if you were someone who heard Black Lives Matter, and this is just to illustrate the example, but if you were someone who heard, the phrase Black Lives Matter, and your default response was that all lives matter, that is more the type of person that I feel would be a blocker to progress than someone who just said, yes, and how can I help say the same? So being vocal and lending your voice to a cause would be different from not understanding the cause well enough to combat it with a similar sounding cause, I think is a good way to put it. So if you think about marching for rights, showing up and helping support a group claim some level of infringement or problem, or trying to proclaim they are also entitled to rights, and being present for it or just being a vocal supporter of it would not be hindering progress. What would be hindering progress would be yes, and so do I, or yes, and this group, or something to that extent. Is how I interpreted I guess the general meaning behind what Dr. King was mentioning or referencing. And I may have missed the mark, but to me, that's the best illustration of how I would describe that type of person, as opposed to someone who wants to understand and someone who wants to explain that understanding and help further that understanding in some fashion.
Yeah. As you were talking, I wondered, so we certainly have a racism problem in this country, and it is, but the question is the racism problem, and this is I'm not asking to elicit a certain response so that I can respond in a certain way, accordingly to the response. But it is a question that I legitimately ask, and that is the racism problem that we have in this country a symptom of a deeper problem, or is it a root problem? Because I'm wondering if it's a symptom of a problem of the class issue that we have in this country, and if we didn't have the class issue that we have, would we also continue to have the racism problem? Maybe, but I could see how the racism problem that we have in our country is a symptom of a deeper problem.
So it should be no surprise that I do have theories, but I certainly don't have an answer. And my theories tend to stem from looking at the way other societies have also battled some level of similar inequalities. And typically, from at least my interpretation of what little bit I can observe, as a generally removed bystander. Like I'm not immersed in those other places to really be able to know for sure. But generally speaking, the influx of another group who did not get to choose their absorption into a society creates that inequality. So even if you take it a step back to inequalities between those who willingly came to an area, those tend to be at least more readily worked through and less systemic in appearance to those where people were forcibly transplanted.
So as a comparison, maybe like the Irish in this country?
Yeah, that's kind of, that's probably a good comparison group to use. And so there is a broader issue from a general human perspective where you have a group of people who never wanted to be here, who finally got to a point where they could be here, and you've had lots of time for that to be a conflict. But you also have just kind of an ingrained difference in view of what it means to be that group of people because of the method of their relocation. And what I mean by that is every group of people in the United States has some other group they look at as either inferior or superior to themselves in some fashion. It's just completely a part of the American view. Until that shift occurs, like we've seen in other countries where there's a more humanistic view because of the time removed from many of those things and work done to make those views be more equal, it can't happen. And the big problem that we have here is that there's not really the work done to make those views more equal. There's work done to provide access to certain rights and privileges that become more equal, but it's done in a way where it champions the difference, which further cements a divide. For example, how often do you hear the proclamations about, well, why is there a Black Miss America or Black entertainment television, as opposed to just doing away with all of it and making the entertainment more homogenous across all networks? Which is what we're finally getting to. But those are the types of things where instead of focusing on trying to make it more ubiquitous across American citizenship, too much was relied on elevating this particular group or granting a specific thing to this particular group, where you're continually still calling out this group. And even if your desire is to make it more equitable, the fact that you still constantly reference this group just cements a difference in mindset, because it's a label that you hear over and over and over. And we don't do that with every group.
And not in the same way, because, just thinking about using certain types of comedy as an example, dark comedy is not for most people. But there's not this sort of like segregation. To use Sam Morrill as an example, because a lot of his comedy is dark. People don't segregate him as, he's the dark comic. It's just that, his comedy is dark and I don't listen to it, versus like him being the dark. Well, maybe dark is a wrong word for this particular conversation, but dark idiomatically as in, what's a synonym for going to a dark place?
Good question.
I know, right? I didn't realize how problematic this is going to be. Gallows humor. I was trying to look up something, and gallows humor seems to be maybe morbid humor or grim humor.
Morbid and grim, I think, are both good options.
Okay. That's what I mean by dark in this context, and so it just. I feel like I stepped right into a bear trap right there. So good job, John. So this sort of grim humor is, it's not segregated in a way that maybe you would look at comedians who are Black and have, speak to the African American community in a way that, it's not for me, it's like I listen to it, like a lot of it I like, but there's a certain place where it gets to, and it's like I don't find it funny because I don't have the cultural context, and it's not specifically for me, and it's I feel like it's so much I feel like it's segregated away from other various types of humor and comedy in a way that other subgenres of the comedy are not, specifically because of the African, because it came from and is for the Black community. And I think where I'm trying to get with this is that the same comparison happens just in the communities, and it's not fair. It's not fair for those communities to be segregated in this way. I think I got a little bit flustered from my choice of words, that I've really lost what the message I'm trying to get out.
Yeah, I mean, I think you got there. maybe the way and just to make sure, I suppose that I do also understand the same way. Because as you were talking, my thought was very similar to talking about dark or somber or morose comedy. And yes, I did pull it up on a thesaurus just to kind of give some other options. But other things in general, whether it's comedy or entertainment or any number of other things, don't get the same level of constant bombardment of it's this thing like race does. And historically, where we've really seen labels constantly used are with I assume African American community is the preferred version. I'm going to continue to say black just because it's the label that we use.
Black is okay too.
Yeah. But because that's what I've heard constantly with regard to like Black Lives Matter. I use the examples of Black Entertainment Television, Blackness America. That's one of the few communities we have constantly heard this level of reference to that community in everything where the community was brought forward, right? And so the closest thing that I can think of that would be a parallel would be religious labels with the Islamic community in general, but it's still not at the same level.
It's not the
and
same.
It's very different in the way it's used.
Right. I was going to say it's not the same because the Islamic community in this country wasn't plucked from their homes and brought here without consent, and all of the majority of Black Americans, African Americans, are here because their ancestors were plucked away from their country, and even to the extent that we only say African American because slave traders pluck them from all over the continent that they themselves, have to use. It's only been recently that the use of genetic sequencing has allowed folks to find out what their background is from. Find out are you Togolese? Are you Senegalese? Are you Kenyan, and so forth. And so it's a lot more the level of prejudice, maybe to mix another word, but it's been extreme prejudice against the Black community because of how they came here, because of how they spent generations in slavery, and then once emancipated, have been.
So as you were speaking, like don't necessarily want to interrupt, but the thing that the kind of that line of train of thought, line of thinking, the generations in slavery was followed by generations of attempted to still be controlled legally outside of the.
You could even say today that it's still slavery. It's just shifted in forms. There's now economic slavery.
It's now there's more of a level of indentured slavery.
And a penal system it's heavily stacked against the Black community, and we've brought up we've said it a few times, and I keep making sure that to remind people of this when they bring it up. ICE is really bad. They're doing really horrible things, and we're we're not even people have said we're not even holding them to the accountability that police officers are being held to. But guess what? That police system that we are referring to, it's also got a lot of problems. So I don't want to lose sight of the fact that yes, while ICE is way worse, and in comparison, the police forces look better, let's also not forget that there's some problems there too. There's a lot of room for improvement everywhere. Again, I also want to make sure that I understand. There's whether you want to say there's a few bad apples in the bunch or there's a lot more bad apples, the problem is it's that you don't know which one the bad apples are, and the thing is that you have to figure. I'll say that I said it before, and I'll say it again. The problem isn't just the bad apples. It's that there is a top-down systemic issue that allows these bad apples to be incredibly problematic, and incredibly problematic for those that are good.
I struggle a little bit with so many aspects of this conversation for a number of different reasons, and none of it is born out of any disagreement. It's born out of humans are so inherently flawed that it's tough to generalize things as a person who has spent so much time trying to argue against generalizations. Going back to, labels and stereotypes and how long I've proclaimed their uselessness in so many different ways. And so it gets to be really interesting to think about the differences between local and state and federal organizations in general, not even limited to law enforcement, but obviously law enforcement being one of the, I'd say the primary topic for at least our current conversation, and how the difference between basic hiring standards for each agency can completely change the experience of each agency. And the fact that there's not some level of uniformity even between neighboring agencies, much less, regional or state level, or, you would think of all professions, any level of law enforcement would have a basic minimum standard that all agencies would adopt. And the fact that there's not makes it really difficult to support any of the other arguments that come from the agency. Hopefully that makes sense, because it's, because we think about general basic human decency or basic human interaction in any way, and we think about what we ask from law enforcement agencies, and the fact that there's not a minimum viable standard, for lack of better phrasing, just really is baffling, because we have this same concept of a basic universal standard for almost every other emergency response styled profession. The difference in the other professions tends to be more along the lines of, are you going to require a 4-year degree or a 2-year degree or no higher education, as long as they meet all of the other basic standards. And you don't even have that consistency in law enforcement.
Yeah, I was going to say, I remember, 5 years ago when defund the police was a popular thing. That only makes sense to people who believe that police should be defunded, and I get it. I get the sentiment there, but it's the wrong terms. It's not that if anything, the police are incredibly, are too underfunded, in the same way that teachers are too underfunded. Our school system, and it's by design. And what I think the sentiment, you could say it's bad marketing, but the sentiment here is that we want to demilitarize the police, and increase education and training of police officers, and increase funding for the police as far, police. I think by and large, police are set up for failure in that they're undertrained, undereducated, and underpaid. It is, those sort of things breed. They seek out people who are. They seek, that attracts bad people in general. Just people who want to be bad, who choose to be bad. It sets people who want to do good. It sets them up for failure, and it breeds corruption. It creates a cesspool for corruption, and I believe that to be by design. I believe that's how you can militarize the police and crack down on communities of the Black community, the Mexican community, other peoples of color, and it further puts people into the prison industrial complex that is rank with corruption, and people getting rich off the backs. It's a different form of slavery.
So this becomes an interesting conversation because it's not necessarily wrong, but I think there's a deeper understanding that's missed that might make more sense with additional context.
Please.
And so let's take a step back to one specific statement that I'm going to extrapolate a little bit further, which is that police are set up for failure. Because across the board, that's accurate.
It's set up for failure in the eyes of the citizen, but necessarily set up for failure in the intent of what is going on by those in power.
Go ahead. There's no distinction. So, and this is why I say the additional context could be interesting, and maybe not. Maybe I just find it more interesting. But law enforcement agencies as a whole, whether it's local, state, federal, doesn't matter. But the police as we know them in the United States are set up for failure. Period. No caveats, no additional context. They are set up for failure. What's interesting is how you unpack that. So what is it that we ask police officers to do? We ask them to be responsible for public safety. When you think about traffic, managing traffic or responding to accidents and helping people in general. So traffic violations, all that stuff is all wrapped into this concept of being responsible for public safety. Same thing can be said for providing security at events and all that kind of stuff. But public safety in general, that's one bucket. We also ask that they be public servants and so be available to respond and help in the case of some situation arising that is not suitable for some other response. So in many areas, when you don't have like mental health response teams, that would fall to law enforcement. Unless you happen to be in a place where the fire department or somebody gets it, right? So it's still a problem, even if the fire department gets it, but the fire department is at least more likely to have additional training for mental health crisis, but that's beside the point. So that's another bucket. So you've got public safety, public service, responding to public need. You have the bucket for crime prevention, which is it's one of the dumbest things that we've ever done. More on that in a moment. And then you have the bucket for law enforcement, which is, crime investigation and punishment, et cetera, et cetera. So you have these things that you're asking a singular agency to provide, and you're not providing them the support and resources to do any one of these things with any level of actual effectiveness. And that's the problem. So when you talk about like demilitarizing the police, you're still only really talking about the law enforcement, maybe the crime prevention piece. Like there's some really gray mental logic leaps you can do to make it match both. But you're not doing anything about public safety, public service.
Yeah, it's a bit of a red herring in the same way that the AR-15 is a red herring when we're talking about gun violence.
Correct.
Because there are so much more gun violence that occurs from handguns. More people die bullets discharged from handguns than they do AR-15s. It's just the AR-15s get, so many. It gets a lot of attention. It gets in the news because it's so obviously problematic and attention grabbing. And so the sort of demilitarization is maybe not a red herring, but it's a small piece of a much bigger problem.
Right.
Because I do remember one, hearing about this and also having this conversation with you, and I'm really glad that you start pulling apart all these things. It's a big issue.
Well, and this is part of why I have so much difficulty with this topic, because it's not that I don't think anything about our current system with regard to law enforcement agencies, the criminal justice system as a whole is effective in the way it's done. Like I have so many problems with it in general. Like we could be here for a long time to really dissect them. But this one particular thing is what makes it often difficult for me to be overly sympathetic to one side or the other when talking about law enforcement, because they are, across the board, not set up for success. And there are plenty of people that I know that are really good people that really want to make a difference, and they're also just not going to ever be successful in the way that we would like them to be. Which makes it difficult when you then have the stories of the ones who are absolute pieces of shit and should never have been involved in any of the agencies to begin with. It really makes the conversation problematic. But all of that to say that once you take this bucket kind of mentality into account, and then you add on two other facts that most people miss, which are, one, that police officers as a whole are not effective at preventing or crime reduction is kind of that you might be able to give credit for. But crime prevention is absolutely just a joke. It's not the only thing that you are doing from a crime prevention standpoint is the same thing that you're doing with a set of locks on a door at your house.
Right.
The police are not really there to prevent crime. They might want to be. They might even believe in that being a mission, but statistics have proven over and over and over across the board, every location, anywhere in the United States, police agencies are not properly staffed or resourced in a way to actually prevent crime. What you do instead is you increase response time, and you hopefully increase the likelihood of evidence collection or something else to lead to closing a case through investigation. But there's a whole separate other problem here where overall effectiveness of investigations for a crime across the board is less than 50%. So all of these things conflate the problem, which is you're asking too much of law enforcement for one agency to handle all these disparate things, and you're defining them in two completely different roles. Either they are law enforcement in some fashion, where you have attempts at crime prevention and reduction and investigation to be their primary focus, or they are public servants helping to respond to public need, and having them attempt to fulfill both means they are destined to never fulfill either properly.
Yep.
If you really want to read about them, I have articles on my blog that I can point you to as well.
Yeah. No, this is exactly...
And this goes back to my master's, because I did the additional concentration with law enforcement administration being part of it, where I have a write-up about the overall effectiveness of investigations and the effectiveness of types of patrol and all that kind of stuff. That it's older now, so certainly dated, but once you realize that this is a perpetual systemic problem for law enforcement as an entire organization, regardless of level, then a lot of these other gaps start to make more sense. Because if you're not training them to be public servants, you're training them to attempt to do something in the law enforcement scope, but then they're having to respond to public service things, and so they're unequipped for it. And vice versa. If you're training, your patrol officers to be more focused on preventative patrol or community policing, things that hopefully reduce crime, then they're ill-equipped to handle the public service role. And so if you're already strapped for funding and already strapped for resources, you really can't do either one effectively because you're trying to balance both.
We have a number of different ways set up for you to get in touch with us to provide feedback, ask questions, or just comment in about something we've discussed.
You can hit us up on Twitter or Instagram at untitled_hosts, or shoot an email over to untitled.hosts@gmail.com.
Or get in touch directly with Jesse at jthart.com, or get in touch with me, John, via telepathy.
If you would like to support our work or are interested in listening to our new after show feed, head over to patreon.com/theUntitledPodcast and take a look at the options we have set up.
Thank you for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed the show.
And we hope to connect with more of you as we continue this journey.
That's a wrap. And it's a little bit of a stretch from the ICE conversation from a like theoretical, ideological standpoint, but the same problem technically is what helped get us to where we are. Now, I say that with a big caveat that leadership of ICE is really fucking problematic, and that's putting it extremely mildly. But part of the problem and part of why we have so many issues currently is because you had a significant lack of funding for proper training, exacerbated by a lack of interest in educated people taking those positions, also exacerbated by a lack of general interest from overall the population in taking those positions. And so the incentives that were provided attracted a certain type of individual, which goes back to the same underlying problem that we were talking about in general.
It's a top-down systematic problem.
Yeah. Like all of my arguments for concerns with law enforcement in general really don't apply to the current issues with ICE, other than from a high-level theoretical perspective, because those problems are what created the void for the current administration to fill vacancies with a specific type of individual. So like it started with a similar problem. It just snowballed into a different problem because of the issues with the top-down administration.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully that's a easy enough way to follow the logic there.
No, I totally follow that. There was a pause in there after you had spoken, and it sounded like a pretty good end. But I really liked this conversation.
And it really goes back to, this is why I have so much difficulty with this conversation, because when you talk about like what Hoover, just to start, trying to narrow it down for examples, like what Hoover does is so much better than what certain agencies do, because they try to promote the things like the crisis response for autistic or neurodivergent people, right? Like there's a whole community outreach piece and component of that they attempt to do that you just don't always see, because Hoover is fortunate enough to have the money to fund that piece. But Hoover also falls into the same trap of, well, are you a public service agency, or are you an enforcement agency? Are you investigative? Like, all of the same problems still apply. It's just that it's just affluent enough because of community support that they can do a little bit better than the average agency in the general vicinity.
Right.
And so you see that kind of thing. It's like, yes, I know there are people who are really trying to make it better. And then you look at statistics about types of crime that occur within, city limits or jurisdictions, and certainly there's been improvement, but it's all still misleading, because this type of crime has gone down, but what about this one that's just been constant? It's really difficult to hone in on any one specific problem when everything about how the organization has been formed and the mandates given to them to operate are just problematic from the get-go. But then again, I also, to hell with law enforcement as a general thing. Like, let's just get rid of the current criminal justice system and go to a pure public service and support agency, and I bet that everything gets better.
Well, what I just heard you say is like we need to change the system from the top down. Yeah.